Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second edition of the Comic Timing. Today, we are back with comic books for yet another discussion. The last one was really well received, and we had we had a lot of viewers watching that, and one of them joins us today for this discussion. So, before I get any further, I'd like to introduce my panel for this evening. We have my constant panelist Abhinav Bhattacharya joining me from Bangalore. Hello, Abhinav.
Hi guys. Hi Akashdeep.
How are you, Abhinav?
All good. All good.
And joining us all the way from the US of A is a very special guest. We have Jessie Christian with us. Hello, Jessie. How are you?
Hi guys, how are you doing? I'm
Hi.
right now from New Jersey. It's a fun time right now. How's everybody today?
We are doing
Yes.
good. Jessie, let's before I start firing the questions, I like you request you to introduce yourself to our viewers. Jesse, just tell us who you are, where you're from, what you do, and how did you find our video in the vast expanse of the internet?
Right. So I'm from New Jersey, as I stated before. I am a teacher
Yeah,
of mathematics during my normal business hours, working hours. And how I found your video was just scrolling through Reddit, just trying to see the typical comic book news traffic. It was on r/comic books. That's where it was specifically, and I found it very engaging and interesting as a
yeah,
discussion, and felt that I could also contribute, possibly.
yeah. We are really glad that we are glad and honored that you found us. You dropped us a comment on our YouTube section. That's how we got in touch with you. And here we are, three of us,
Mhm.
back again to talk about our favorite things, comic books.
Right.
Jesse, I'd like to start off with you. I'll just begin with the very basic question. Just tell us how you got introduced to comic books and as a genre. Do you remember the first set of comic books that you landed your hands on? Like, how did your journey with comic books and the comic universe begin?
Okay. So I think with most people who are in the 20 to 30 range, um, very few people I know started reading. They started with like the TV shows, the animated series. For me
Yeah,
specifically, Batman the animated series, that was the big one. Superman the animated series, all of the DC AU, that is like the big influence for me, as well as like stuff like X-Men and Spider-Man from the 90s. That's like that whole 90s is like a big comic book cultural touchstone for a lot of people growing up who really wanted to get
yeah,
into characters, but didn't necessarily like understand the idea that these characters came from somewhere else, not just the big
yeah,
screen, small screen. Um,
yeah,
the first, I think, like comic book I ever really like picked up and read like fully was, I think I borrowed a copy of Civil War, the Marvel event from the early aughts.
Okay.
Um, and I read that completely cold, completely blind. Uh, I wound up enjoying it a little bit. I liked it. Despite now looking back and learning more and more about it, I realize how certainly controversial that event was for a lot of readers at the time.
yeah,
um, but I also did learn that that story was very, very influential as far as like where Marvel and where other companies would go as far as their like big like line wide crossover event type deals. So that was like my big like first comic book introduction, and slowly but surely I would start adding more and more into my repertoire, and now I read like so much. So but we all have to start somewhere, right?
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah.
Avinav, coming to you, I'd like to ask you a different question today. Fantasy and comic books as genres in traditional and pop literature are very significant parts, significant aspects. Would you tell us a bit about their importance, relevance, significance, and most importantly, the origins?
Totally, Akashdeep. And what I feel, what Jesse just mentioned, right? There are very thin lines between, how you make it big or you go controversial, right? If you are thinking about, like, as he had mentioned about the Civil War, how it has been depicted, or it might not towards one culture. So, this particular second edition of our whole, program is quite quintessential. And what I feel is like both are not far away if you consider the intent of creation, fantasy and, I mean, basically fantasy and comics, yet
Yeah.
light years apart, right? In terms of literary genre, and another a piece of art in relevant terms. The significance of fantasy as a genre is huge, as people in general prefer the imaginary world. I believe, just my opinion, because it's
Yeah.
endless. Like, fantasy is endless, and then again,
Yeah.
fantasy as a genre allows it like getting sucked into a black hole, more like involving technology. uh, if you consider right now technology evolution, such as amazing genre which it is now being depicted on screen. So
Yeah.
imagine a Franz Kafka in the early 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, who imagined or who came about a creation as a fantasy, genre writer about the entirety of metamorphosis, which was quite great, which was quite different. Now imagine the origins, elements of the supernatural and the fantastic, were always a part of literature in its beginning. The modern literature or the genre in itself, distinguishes itself from the tales and folklore of today. So the whole point is like always the genre which begins literature is fantasy, but you cannot sideline comic books because that's the
Yeah.
first thing which you hold. So that's my
Yeah.
point.
Okay. Jesse, tell us
Yes.
about your favorite comic book character, your favorite series, something, one particular character, if you can, that stayed with you forever. I mean, till now.
And that is, yeah, that is a question. It's
Yeah.
a hard one. Because
I know. I know. I know.
I get it. You get into the medium and you want to like everybody because you want to read all these books and all these characters have all these characters have a reason to exist, right? So
Yeah. Absolutely.
you want to dig into that and really like figure out why these characters are around, what they're all about. But if there's one character that's always I think like stayed with me in a way because he his basis was always revolving around change. Everything that they've done to him from his initial inception was always about reinventing him, finding new ways to challenge him. That would be Bruce Banner, the Hulk.
Totally.
He is I think one of the like quintessential Marvel characters. He has dominated the he is I think an A-lister as far as like where you would consider his like place in the Marvel like character pantheon. He's had a TV show. He has had multiple interpretations on the big screen. Mark Ruffalo, Eric Bana, Edward Norton. So many different people
Edward
have
Norton.
like and Lou Ferrigno, of course. The
Absolutely.
yeah, all of like these different interpretations of this like one character who at its core can just transform. He is a reflection of his own rage, his own anger, all of his like but even further when you had like writers like Peter David come on and Bill Mantlo, and they added like different personalities to him, and they tied back all of his like different personalities to like you know him growing up with child abuse and like
Yeah.
Exactly.
it's like that is a character that at a surface level, if you don't really look too deep, all you see is the big green rage monster that just grunts a lot. But if
Yeah.
you really, really dive deep into who the Hulk is, what the Hulk I think represents as far as like, like our own like struggles in life, like trying to deal with our own personal demons, like that is like a very like pervasive and interesting character. And for my money, like Hulk has just always like benefited from constantly like, re-updating, reinventing. He is a
Yeah.
character that, in the beginning, a lot of people probably don't know this, but his initial like first 6 issues by Lee and Kirby, those were canned. Those were canceled after the 6th issue. And
Yeah.
they like spent a few years until he came back into the zeitgeist where people were like, he had developed a cult following and people wanted him back. But like what those 6 issues kind of exemplify is that they were just changing things with him constantly. It was never just one status quo for him. It was always just he had one thing, then he went to something else, then he went to something else, and that has just kind of stuck with the character, and that's what I really like. That they're always like changing this character, and he's always responding to it in a very interesting ways, even in more modern settings like Planet Hulk. That was intense and amazing.
Thank you, Jesse, for sharing your perspective. When you said Bruce, I thought you were going to say Bruce Wayne, but
Yeah,
you
Batman.
said Banner.
Right.
Yeah, because Bruce Wayne, and this happens to be my favorite character.
Of course.
So I thought we'd be on the same page. But no, nevertheless, both the Bruces are equally important from two separate universes.
Right.
Abhinav, coming to you, let's talk about character development and its importance from an author's point of view in traditional literature and comic culture.
Totally, Akashdeep, and I completely believe what Jesse just mentioned, right?
Yeah.
So coming from the last question, right, I just want to, it should be a continuation around the same topic for me.
Yeah.
Basically because arguably, I repeat again, arguably, I think the first fantasy fiction book ever written was 1001 Nights, or in popular genre, it's called, the Arabian Nights, which is
Yeah.
written by multiple writers. It's like, okay, I write a few chapters, you write it more. But imagine when it was written. Nobody knows the date. It's definitely before the 16th AD, 1600 AD, right? So imagine the fantasy element which that brought about, and in different aspects, like you have a different version of TV element today, or TV or silver screen element today in the entire Middle East about the Arabian Nights. And if you consider the Indian element, we have something called Alif Lela, which started in 19th century, or basically around the 1990s. But was it written there? No, it was written well before that. So coming back to the current question, from the history to the current, and basically around the character development of the whole perspective today, extremely important. Other than a few other literary genres like crime fiction, detective fiction, you will have a very few characters non-living, which makes it big. But take a pause, and consider fantasy fiction and comics. Boom, it's all about character development, right? And it's all completely about it. Now imagine the author's vision around this core development and the character's positioning in the plot. So just think about the author, how he has to, think early or think late, whatever, about basically the character. Insane work there. And as we, discussed last week, I think around J.R.R. Tolkien's Golem as a character, right? It was actually thought about in the early 19th century, and we are where today, 2020, 2017. A game came out, and they still promoted the Golem character. So it's still alive almost after 100 years, or almost after a century, which is great. And it was always well written, and I feel either tech media or whatever media goes on around, fantasy as a genre will not be, sublime just because people don't imagine things. Books written in print will always remain, but then graphic is another element which goes into that. So we are talking
Yeah.
to you basically about two angles, uh, in print and graphics, or a graphic novel, what comes into the comic book structure. And similarly, I feel for comics, you can't name one. It's always a crime, right? I mean, everything almost about characters in comic books is about character development. You might forget about the name of the comic, but the character is always paramount. Like as Jesse mentioned, right? Hulk, you might forget about the name. They might change the name of the comics tomorrow, but Hulk as a character, or as you mentioned, it might be even something like, even if it's a Marvel creation, or if it's a manga or anything else, like what will happen is like the names might change, but the characters always remain. You cannot change the name of the character because characters are there and will always be there. So that's my point. I mean, it's brilliant. Character development is paramount for both the genres.
Okay. Thank you, Abhinav.
Great point.
Jesse,
Yes.
I would like to ask for your views when it comes to comic books being a significant part of cultures across different countries, say India, Japan, or the West. You are somebody who was born and brought up in the West, from the US of A.
Mm.
How do you see, the correlation between comic books and its impact on culture? And by culture, I'm not just referring to pop culture, the cultural fabric or the cultural spectrum overall.
Right. Yeah. So I think like maybe about like 20, 30 years ago, I think like comic books, superheroes, that like, type of stuff, that was a subculture. And like, there were people, we had groups, we had like, there were fan followings. It was
Yeah.
very isolated. Now, I think more so with things like the MCU, things like the DCEU, like making like these like characters like more well known, more like global in a way. That is the culture. Like
Yeah.
it long forgotten are the days when you could like you were growing up and people would make fun of you for reading these things and you're like, that's like, what are
Yeah.
you doing? That's not cool.
Absolutely.
That's not sports. That's not like a Tom Brady poster or something. This is just like, and it's just like, but I mean, you kept doing it, and eventually you see an evolution where now like everyone's like, Captain America is my favorite. I want to see the new Batman. Everyone just is like crazy about these new superheroes, and like so that is like the transition point. I think, like comic books, superheroes, that genre, that is the culture. That is where everything is headed now. And I remember like the hysteria around Endgame, like the last like big
Yeah.
Marvel movie, like so many like of the ticket servers crashing. There were like flash mobs of people trying to like get into the midnight premiere. Yeah, exactly. Like that is like a cultural touchstone probably for a lot of people growing up now around there. Um, and I also wanted to talk about with regards to superheroes and comics, the writer Grant Morrison has like a really cool theory or like a really cool idea about what superheroes represent. They they now more than ever have become like modern myth. They are gods. They are like how older people or like older cultures used to look at like Zeus and like Neptune, like those like great beings. Like these like comic book like characters have almost like been like deified. They've been like put on like great like like pedestals of like it's really interesting to see like how like these fan followings have like cultivated around such like interesting characters. But that I think that was like I think it was like super gods. That was Grant Morrison's theory regarding around like where the genre was always heading. These characters were always going to be elevated because fans are constantly doing that. They believe in these characters, so it's kind of like that. They are the modern myth is basically what he was going for, which is really cool to think about.
Totally.
That's an excellent point that you put forth. They are a modern myth.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Abhinav, you're an author. You're a published author. I want your perspective on the importance of an author when it comes to keeping in mind the cultural impact when the author creates a character, a story, and a world, when he builds a world. What is the how important is it for an author to keep all these things in mind? Culture, character, and creation.
Well, it's very important, and especially as Jesse has mentioned, one thing for sure, cultural myth, or the new myth which we have created
Yeah,
around it, which he has mentioned, is completely paramount. And period, there is nothing beyond that. Especially superheroes, right? uh, what superheroes were and now is a complete
Yeah.
depiction in all. Forget about print media or, earlier they cartoons or caricature which used to come in your newspapers or print media
Yeah.
is now visual, and people will always realize, so we have to grow as readers or viewers and into this particular genre. So that's very quintessential. And what I feel is like, of course, because you don't want a reader to hate you as an author, and you don't want dislike and hate, again has a huge gap, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
mentioned in the last episode, comics, as a young, if you were in the young, category of readers, basically you pick up a comic book. But if you consider a young genius who wrote a comic book like Herge, the creator of Tintin comics, the infamous, series of comics which came about, he was actually, it was quite messed up. His first particular creation was quite messed up. He was quite young when he created it. It was in his teens, and he wrote about Tintin and Congo, which was quite, it had a racial angle to it, and he apologized. Again, it was discussed in the UN, by the Republic of Congo as a union that they did not like what was in that content. But he was very young.
Yeah.
After that, he wrote almost, or he even created, it's not written though, it's a graphic novel, Tintin. Basically, he, created around 20 more or 25 more, even 100 more, creations of his. So that's the thing, as an author or a creator, not just for fantasy, just even for, uh, for comic books, as a creator, have to think about and consider, because once you step across the line, it's quite weird over there. It was
Yeah.
weird. Uh, I would say what I feel eventually. And again, the second angle is you cannot bore your readers, right? If you write about a particular culture, you might take about, if you consider crime or any other fictional elements around outside fiction or comic books, right? Crime is somewhere, characters again come into the picture. Like you consider today a Poirot, or even, Sherlock Holmes or Moriarty. So these are characters which will run across and you will watch it no matter what. But when it comes to fiction, again, character development is very important, and characters stick there. Like imagine a golem after, 100 years or a century, or anybody in the Star Wars, or anybody anywhere around, the comic book structure, whatever has been there since almost 50 odd years or 100 odd years. So my whole point is like, we cannot create while writing, we cannot, as an author, create a concept which is boring after 1 month, because readers are paramount, not anybody else, not the governments or not nobody else. Modern culture, I feel, readers, if they hate you, and there is again a difference between dislike and hate, but if they hate you, they're going to bone you. And if the readers bone you, you're nowhere as an author. Readers are paramount, so you have to take that into consideration while imagining things around character development.
Uh, Thank you so much, Avina, for giving us your perspective and most importantly, highlighting the core difference between dislike and hate.
Yeah, that's important.
Dislike is when you don't agree with something, so you don't like it.
Yeah,
And hate, for lack of a better word, is a very, very strong word. Hate is a very strong word.
Right.
And that's very important for people to, acknowledge and understand that you might not like something, but hating it is different. And readers are paramount. If they bone you, if they don't like you, uh, that totally destroys your career trajectory. And thank you so much, Avina, for putting out that pertinent point and highlighting its importance. Jesse, coming back to you, I'd like to ask, I say, like, comic books and characters have been adapted into countless TV shows, and films worldwide, and they enjoy tremendous fan following. Like as you said, as the new myth,
Right.
people are mad behind certain comic books, certain characters, certain films, certain cellular adaptations, and they have also been a key player and a key contributor to the space of pop culture. How do you see this entire thing?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a two-pronged attack from my end. I firmly believe that this is the future of the medium. As in, like, I love comic books, I love the print medium, but I also acknowledge its limitations in a sense.
Yeah,
I think it's probably easier for most people to watch something, either a movie or a TV show, than it is to just read, if that makes sense.
yeah,
I mean, that
absolutely does.
that kind of isn't great that that people aren't reading, but if the goal is to get exposure, then I think the
Yeah,
movie and the TV show, it does a huge benefit. It serves a huge benefit to characters that may not necessarily always have that popularity in like comic book circles. Because I think like
yeah,
there's a comic book following and then there's like a general fan following, and sometimes there's overlap, but in general the fan following around the movie, the TV show is usually a lot larger from what I've noticed in more recent times. um, that there's like other things that go into that like comic book marketing isn't always the best compared to like TV movie marketing. The movie TV market is just so much more lucrative right now, so you know that's just where, but that's just I think where the future is headed, as far as like, so much so that even certain comic books now are being like are considered as like rough drafts for movie scripts. That is a thing that has been constantly seen throughout the last like 10 or so years, that like more and more comic books are becoming like like jumping off boards for like directors and writers and other creative people to like use these ideas, reinvent them a little bit, and now we have a movie, and now we have,
yeah,
and to that there's I think both a good and a bad thing. It sort of has a feedback loop when the comics copy the movies and then the movies comic books, just back and forth, not necessarily the best thing. But on the flip side, I do like that these movies get these characters out there and into the zeitgeist, which is, I think, the goal. And if we can do that in a good way, then that loop isn't so terrible. For example, I polled a lot of people in the last like 10 or so years about what their feelings about the character of Iron Man is concerned. And almost everybody comes back to me and says, comic book Iron Man, I could not give a damn. But by God, RDJ is the best damn, Robert Downey Jr. is the best damn Iron Man I have ever seen, ever, in literally anything. And if that doesn't show you, that is the peak of the idea. That if we can get, like, if we can, like, peel out the continuity that, like, readers are so obsessed with and just hone in on something that we can improve from the source material and have readers be invested in that, then I think that is good. And that is what like these adaptations should strive for, on top of having that general exposure that like the print media can't necessarily reach, which is why I feel that this is the future of the medium itself. Obviously, keep printing comic books. That is a great time for everybody, but that's where I think it's headed, personally, from my end, just based on everything that I've seen.
Jesse, you have hit the nail on this one, and most importantly, you mentioned about this one character, which is so different when it comes to comic books and when it comes to the on-screen portrayal. Iron Man. I have read Iron Man comics. I've been reading them as a kid. I read them as a young teenager. But in 2008, when John Favreau came up with his directorial, when he decided to portray Iron Man on the big screen, and he decided to pick up one of the most, you know, how do I put it, one of the most
Polarizing.
controversial or one of the most
Polarizing.
popular actors ever, RDJ, Robert Downey Jr. That thing blew it, and the magnanimity was unprecedented. It just exploded. his screen presence, his gadgets. Then you had Gwyneth Paltrow also on the side, and they also deployed another very important angle, another tool to it. They use uh, a nearly three 3.5 decade old song from Black Sabbath in that film.
Of
It's called also called Iron Man,
course.
and that is something which attracted rock metal musicians and music fans. Like I happen to be a metalhead on the side. I've been listening to metal music all my life, and so the entire end product which you got, like the comic book adaptation, John Favreau, Robert Downey Jr., Gwyneth Paltrow, and the song in the background, like Iron Man. The end product which you got was magnanimous, and magnanimous would be an understatement. So I totally agree with you on this one. So when it comes to comic books and on-screen portrayals, and yeah, Iron Man, I love the song, and I also love the movies. And so,
Yeah.
thank you, Jesse. Avinav, coming back to you, fantasy as a genre draws humongous fan following when it comes to adaptation to cinema or television. As an author, how early do you consider when it comes to writing to make sure that the creation ends up or reaches mainstream pop culture?
Difficult to judge, Akashdeep, and sometimes when you are writing as an author, your vision is limited. And especially generally, if your thinking happens, it's not just good practice, definitely. Once you are in a phase when you're writing, you go about, okay, I write a manuscript, I give it to a particular editor or publisher, and let's see how it goes. So that's not how, a series concept happens, right? If you are not thinking about a series concept, nobody is interested today in the mass media, especially the Netflixes or anybody in that genre or Hotstars or Prime Videos. So basically, I would say all of that is bogus because imagine George R. R. Martin or J. R. R. Tolkien uh, were not born in a day. Uh, it took time, and they were, of course, they knew how scripts were written. George R. R. Martin, I think a couple of episodes back when we were discussing him, I mentioned that it was his second job. Basically, he was reviving his career as a script writer. That's how he came about his new set of books, which completely changed the game. Starting in 1991,
Yeah,
when he started writing about the whole series, which now in HBO is called, Game of Thrones. So
Game of
it
Thrones.
takes time, but then I think it's one point vision, and it's the soul separator.
Jesse, I'd like to. I'm actually heading towards the end of my question, like the discussion. I want to talk about a mass event in pop culture which originated from comic books. It's called Comic Con. It originated in San Diego, the SDCC, and now over the years it has snowballed into this massive cultural event spanning different geographies, different countries. What are your views on Comic Con? How do you see it? Is it all about inclusivity for comic book fans, or is it just a marketing gimmick which plays on sentiments and emotions of comic book lovers?
Um, well, I think with most things, it has to be a little bit of both. Always,
Yeah,
they have to market. This is the best way to do
yeah,
it. But I also think that cons itself, they are a reflection, a window into what the modern zeitgeist is for geek culture, pop culture, stuff like that.
yeah,
Um, I view it with like San Diego and New York and other cons. It's like a melting pot. You have so many different people, races,
yeah.
nationalities coming together to just celebrate let's celebrate like a lot of different like genres and shows, TV shows, comic book characters. Um, and of course, yeah, it has to be a little bit of the play on the fans. They need fans to come to these things. They need to market. It can be a little marketing gimmicky like that, but I also think that there's a lot of fun to be had at those types of events. Not
It's
so
like
much
the
right
best of both
now.
worlds.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Abhinav, I'd like to ask you, like, when it comes to mass events and its impact on the sale of books and comic books, I want your point of view as an author. How do you see the correlation between a mass event and the sell, the marketing, the propagation, and the overall impact of a book that you've just created as an author?
I feel like Akashdeep, it's huge, and I say huge. It's very important for comics because, again, as you know, it's a social taboo over here in India that kids only read comics, which is not
No,
correct.
only kids read comics. It's both ways.
Exactly.
Kids read only comics, and only kids read comics, and that taboo needs to be smashed.
Yes.
Exactly. And this is not the right way forward, right? Even we
Yeah,
read comics, and if we read comics, or as I said in my previous videos, like if we hold a comic book today, we'll be
yeah.
looked with a different eye today. So
We'll
that
be ostracized.
exactly. So this needs to change, and because comic books are not for kids, it might be the first thing because as a kid, you might visually, connect with that angle that okay, as a kid, you like a comic book or you hold a comic book before a novel, definitely because of
Yeah,
one thing. It's visual, right? That's how graphic
yeah.
or illustrations work. But that's great. But then it's not meant for kids. And look at the content today a manga has, or even a DC or a Marvel has. So we cannot just live away with it. So as I was saying, Akashdeep, basically around the whole concept of Comic Con as a mass event, and it's quite essential because especially for countries around the southeastern, or even Asia Pacific, if you consider the Southeast Asian countries, uh, I feel more than metropolitan cities, it should digress outside and go to the actual quintessential center of each of the smaller cities and even townships across this particular region because that's where the fan following would even grow. It's not effective that people think metros are more suitable for this. It's not really true, and that's my whole take on this.
Apart from that, you've put forth a very pertinent point. I'd like to reiterate what I said earlier. Comic books are not only for kids, and only kids don't read comic books. They are for everybody.
True.
Anybody who enjoys a story, anybody who enjoys a character, anybody who enjoys reading. It's for everybody, and we need to stop looking at people from that judgmental lens. It's for one and all.
Agreed.
Jesse, I'd like to ask the last question of this discussion. What are you currently reading?
Right. So, I think I already mentioned that, like, the big two are, like, where my, like, reading focus is usually. Occasionally some indies here and there. Big two has a lot of stuff. Not all of it is great, but, there are a few titles that are a cut above the rest. And then there's, like, one or two titles that are just, like, on the tippy top. And I've already kind of mentioned that Bruce Banner is my favorite character. And let me just so if you can kind of see it,
Yeah.
kind of see it
Yeah.
on screen. This is The Immortal Hulk by Al Ewing and Joe
Wow.
Bennett.
Yeah.
That is
Wow.
this is the right now this is the gold standard for me. Comic book storytelling of the characterization of Bruce Banner, one of my favorite characters.
Yeah.
If I had to it's drawn comparisons, and I kind of agree that this is like akin to Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, as far as like how he's cultivated like a horror like take around Bruce, which is, I believe, the original interpretation of the character. Stan Lee was going for, well, Lee when he was writing it was going for the Jewish golem. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and Kirby was going more for a nuclear war post Fallout type deal, and this combines all of that together into one like monstrous package, and it's just this is a fantastic read for any new reader, any old reader will love this. This is just a quintessential character story for this character, and I love this book. I've read it. I've read this hardcover. I've read the other hardcover. I've read every issue over and over and over again. It just I've never read something so much that it just continually improves every time I catch something new and new detail. The creative team on this have just crafted something truly special, and it is just a triumph to see this book every every month, every 2 weeks that it comes out. It's just a fantastic read. I recommend it to anybody. Sorry, I really had to get that out. This book, it's changed my life in a way where this is like all I think about. The new issue that like I'm already thinking about the new issue that comes out next week. There's 2 of them, and I'm really excited. So it's still ongoing, which is the best part about this. So we can keep talking about it. But yeah,
and that's the whole difference, right, Akashdeep? What actually Jesse has mentioned. This is a graphic novel. It's as thick as it gets. You don't call it comics anymore. After 2015, you basically call it illustrative, graphic novel. So that's what it is, and it's really up there. And this, I think, this genre, as a part of literary culture, will always continue. And as Jesse has mentioned, right, just from a character development, right, Hulk. Look at it right now.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Absolutely. And the way Jesse expressed his love for the character, that is a strong sentiment which all of us share. All comic book lovers, we all share the same sentiment, same strength and intensity. We love comics, and there's always that one character which we really love, and we are head over heels for that. Abhinav, the last and final word of this discussion, I give it to you.
I'm currently reading this particular book. It's Yiftach Reicher Attir's The English Teacher. It's on espionage. I think this is one genre we have never, acknowledged a very, in a deep way. Soon we should.
We will.
We will. And that's what I feel. I mean, this was quite well written. And that's how espionage begins, and how the whole contemporary way of espionage around Mossad. Basically, it's a Israeli story of how you do espionage as just an English teacher, as a backdrop of work which they do, just to make sure they come about the whole plot. So the author actually worked for Mossad, but then he came up with a fictional story. So that was quite brilliant, because he couldn't write facts, right? You cannot write espionage facts as is. Not only any country cannot write, any country's intelligence, bureaus or whatever we have, cannot come out and write fiction directly, or write facts especially. So this was quite great for me, because it was quite well portrayed, and I think it's even projected in certain genres in terms of movies or popular culture in terms of media. So that was quite great for me.
Okay, thank you so much, Aruna, for sharing your weekly reading list. That brings us to the end of this discussion, and trust me, I'm saying this on the bottom of my heart. This is one of the best discussions I've ever had when it comes to this particular genre. And Jesse, I am so happy that you joined us today. It was an absolute honor to talk about comic books with someone like you and Abhinav. And ladies and gentlemen, that was the Comic Timing Part 2. My name is Akashdeep Baruah. Thank you so much for watching.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.